Welcome back to the channel, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm going to be attempting to answer one of the questions that has plagued mankind for eternity, and that is, what is stress? But in all seriousness, having a deeper and more sophisticated understanding of stress is something that personally has had probably the biggest impact on the way I write programs for my clients and also improving my client outcomes and results as well. If I had to sum up what we do as coaches, especially when it comes to program design and achieving results with our clients, it's basically just the controlled application of stress to a system to achieve desired outcomes. Because the reality is most personal trainers, S&C coaches, and maybe not so much physios these days, they have an understanding of stress that pretty much dates back to the 1920s. And that is general adaptation syndrome, which was developed by Hans Selye. Basically, he just tortured a bunch of rats in a lab and then measured how long it took them to recover from the bout of stress, and that's how we came up with general adaptation syndrome. So what's wrong with general adaptation syndrome and still using that as your primary understanding of stress? Well, for starters, general adaptation syndrome was theorized over a century ago, and we just have better and more sophisticated models to inform our understanding of stress these days. And so by torturing a whole bunch of rats in a lab and then just measuring their recovery times, Hans Selye sort of came up with this idea that rats, and by extension of that humans, have not only a purely biological response to stress, but also one that is highly predictable. And so majority of traditional periodization is founded on this concept of general adaptation syndrome and this purely biological and predictable response to stress. This is why when you look at old programming textbooks, it's like, oh yeah, if you want your client to make this amount of gains in 12 weeks, we're gonna run a 4-week phase of this, and then we'll run a 4-week phase of this, and then we'll run a 4-week phase of this, and then bing, bang, boom, I can tell you exactly how this is gonna play out, and when you should do your testing day, and when to expect your PRs. But any trainer with skin in the game or any level of experience knows that this is absolutely not the case. Enter George Engel. So George Engel was a psychiatrist, and he just felt like biology and general adaptation syndrome was an inadequate way of explaining the human response to stress. And so he theorized the biopsychosocial model, this idea that responses to stress are a little bit unpredictable, they're dynamic, they're complex and multifactorial. And so absolutely, there is a huge biological component to stress, but it's also our thoughts, beliefs, and expectations that have a huge impact on how we handle, tolerate, and respond to that stress. And it's just not as predictable as what it's made out to be. A professional athlete or someone who lives in a training camp probably mimics the stress response of a rat in a lab a little bit better. But if you're out there coaching real humans who have families and who have jobs, it's much more likely that they have a much less predictable response to stress because there's so many different variables impacting them at any given time. By the way, if any of this chat is resonating with you, I highly recommend you check out my GPP Level 1 course. It outlines my entire training model, especially my understanding of stress, how we apply it to programming to drive the best results for our clients here at General Physical Preparation, as well as how we approach strength training, conditioning, Olympic lifting, sprinting, plyometrics, did I say endurance? I can't remember. Anyway, if you want to understand how we develop world-class strength and conditioning programs for our clients here at General Physical Preparation, that's where you're going to work out how to do it. And so if you accept this more complex biopsychosocial understanding of stress, how does this influence the way we write and manage our programming? If I had to sum it up in 2 words, they would be reactivity and collaboration. And so if we go back to this traditional understanding of periodization that was underpinned by general adaptation syndrome, we're left with a much more proactive and authoritarian approach to program design. Your client would come to you, express their goals, you'd be like, yep, I know exactly what to do with you. You open up your programming textbook and you would lay out 3 concurrent phases of training, and that would get your client to their goals in an extremely predictable manner. You know, the classic one for strength training, you have your hypertrophy or accumulation phase, you have your intensification or your more specific strength phase, and then you'd run through a peaking block and test. And all of those phases would be proactively mapped out because, again, humans have a predictable and biological response to stress. The biopsychosocial approach, it actually forces you to collaborate with your client and work with them a lot more collaboratively, you know, respecting their intelligence, respecting their thoughts and their preferences on the situation, and just being way less proactive. So a reactive approach to programming is just, let's put someone through a week of training or a couple of weeks of training, and then we'll just see what happens and we'll react to that, rather than thinking of this predictive wizard with a crystal ball that can see into the future. And not only is this approach to programming, in my opinion, much more scientifically sound, it's just a more enjoyable process for me as the coach and also for the consumer or the client. It honestly makes my life so much easier as a coach because I enjoy collaborating with my clients. I want to know what they think about the program. I want to know what their favorite exercise is. As a coach, I really enjoy this biopsychosocial approach to programming that's much more collaborative and reactive, rather than being an authoritarian guru who pretends to have a crystal ball that can see into the future and just tell them exactly how things are going to pan out. I enjoy working with my client, finding out what makes them tick. You know, a really great example of this would be like the time to peak concept. This is something that Mike Chisholm talks about a lot. He's one of the best and most forward-thinking strength coaches in the world, in my opinion. So again, in classical periodization, all of your phases and the length of them is mapped out in advance, and we deload people proactively. So, you know, the classic one is either 4-week cycles or 6 to 8 week cycles of training, and then you deload them and then you change phases. Whereas with this time to peak approach, what you do is you design your client a sick week of training and you put them through it and you see how they respond to it, and then you just keep stacking these weeks of training and you track their progress. So this is pretty static. And so your client is just repeating this week of training again and again and again. And you would expect that by repeating this week of training again and again and again, that they get a little bit better each week. But then there's going to come a point where performance starts to dip and you get diminishing returns, or they start to accumulate too much fatigue, or maybe they start feeling a little bit more beat up or unmotivated. And then we deload them reactively. And so rather than just giving every single one of your clients 6 to 8 week phases of training, you might find that some of your clients have 3 weeks time to peak. Some of your clients have 5 weeks time to peak. Some of your clients might take 6 weeks or even longer to peak before they need a deload. And don't get me wrong, there are so many coaches still operating under this general adaptation syndrome, traditional periodization theory model of programming, who do a lot of these concepts intuitively. But rather than just expecting people to understand that humans are individual and saying that it's a common sense thing, I actually like to look towards modern scientific principles that have been developed, so we actually have clear frameworks to teach people these ideas. So just to wrap this up, you should think about more than just the individual and the biological aspects of training stress. You also can let go of this expectation to be this all-knowing guru who knows exactly what your client needs. You find out what your client needs through trial and error, and also collaborating with them and factoring in their preferences. Thoughts, beliefs, and expectations have a huge impact on the way that we tolerate, process, and respond to training stress. And you should make a concerted effort to understand your client's specific and highly individual response to stress, rather than just giving everyone the same length of training phase, or just deloading them every 4 weeks because that's what it said to do in a textbook. Anyway, if you want to have an understanding of programming that actually embraces individualization and with a modern, sophisticated understanding of stress, come join me in GPP Level 1. You get access to my full curriculum of pre-recorded content that describes my entire training model. There's a Discord community. We have 3 live calls a week where we can help you with troubleshooting and applying these concepts, or just giving you a bit of a rev up and motivation and support. And it's just one payment and you get lifetime access. So I think it's insane value. Check it out down below. If you're not ready for that, go check out some of my free programs because there's some cool stuff in there as well. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed the video and I'll see you next time.